Hello there and welcome to my channel Pixelology. My name is Sophia and this series I'll talk about how light works. I'm sure some of you remember a scenario just like this to happen to you before in the past. You're taking a picture of a person, but as soon as our distance to the model or the lighting conditions change just a little bit, the picture is no longer properly lit. How does something like this happen? To master light as a beginner, I'll tell you in part 1 how light behaves. The next time, in part 2, I'll tell you why shadows are sometimes hard and sometimes soft, and which different methods you can use to make your pictures brighter. Well then, let's get to the bottom of this mystery. You might ask yourself, isn't light just there so you can see something in the picture at all? Well, yes and no. Of course you need light to be able to photograph something. That is clear. But even more important is the message that can be conveyed by the different lighting moods. It's not for nothing that landscape photographers often wait for hours and hours on end for the perfect moment. Have you ever seen a portrait of a businessman where you thought, oh my god, that picture doesn't match his profession at all? Or let's put it this way. Would you be treated by a dentist who uses a dramatic looking portrait of himself as a promotional image? If you're like me, I'm sure you're just shaking your head in horror too. A good photographer knows how to use light and paint with it. The right lighting mood gives the picture its soul. Emotion and purpose of an image are very important factors if you want to create a great image. I will talk about these in more detail in a separate video. But to be able to play with light, you must first know how light behaves. Which brings us back to our first question. How does light work? Let's assume for a moment that light is like water and the light source is the opening of a water hose. Depending on which attachment you have on the water hose and how large the opening of the hose is, more or less water comes out, as well as a more or less focused beam. Let's look at this with an example. Let us also assume a good water pressure and also that the water jet is not bound by gravity, but keeps moving in its original direction. Also imagine a funnel shape for an opening. How does the water jet spread, you think? For the sake of simplicity, let's imagine only a two-dimensional streak of water. Depending on how close the object or person we want to photograph is to the light source and thus to the water hose, the more water we'll get on them and the wetter they will be. As soon as the person moves away from the light source, however, the amount of light that still reaches the person decreases steadily. So you can see, as the distance increases, less and less light reaches the object or person, and thus the person is less and less illuminated. If you shine a flashlight on the person in front of you, then almost certainly 100% of the light beam will land on the person and illuminate them. However, if the person moves back several meters, the light beam widens, and probably only about 30% of the light will actually still hit the person. The rest will be lost to your surroundings. What you also need to understand is the following, especially if you are shooting portraits or objects. In photography, there are brightness, such as diffusers or reflectors, and there are shaders or black screens. Brightness can be all kinds of bright or reflecting surfaces. These include white walls or masonry, glass, metals, or mirrors. Brightness serves to refract light and reflect it across the surface. Shaders, on the other hand, serve to absorb the light, or rather to swallow it. Therefore, the darker a surface is, the more light it absorbs. That's why black walls are often used to deliberately darken an area to create contrast in photography. So why am I telling you this? On the one hand, it's important to know what to look out for when photographing a person. There might be a white wall in your studio or a mirror reflecting light on a location. So be aware of your surroundings and how it will affect your image. On the other hand, it is also relevant when it comes to contrast and when painting with light. So what does light have to do with contrast? Generally speaking, the larger and softer the light source, the softer the shadows, and the lower the contrast in your image. On the other hand, the straighter the light rays are and more compressed the light source is, the harder the light hits the subject. This results in higher contrasts and harder shadows. Next time I will talk about how straight rays and diffused rays influence contrast and shadows in greater detail, and how they come about, as well as different methods to brighten your images. Everything I've talked about or am going to be talking about in the future, I either learned in training, from experience, from the experience of other people or colleagues, or simply doing my research. If you don't agree with my point of view, please feel free to do your own research on the matter concerned. Thank you for watching my video. I really appreciate you taking the time. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, stay safe. Bye!